Hello everyone and welcome back to another class on the Industrial Revolution. As always, we're going to start with our learning outcomes, and by the end of today's class you should know some of the reforms that were brought in to improve the living conditions and some of the key reforms within the Industrial Revolution. You should also know two different types of economy theories that emerged from the Industrial Revolution in response to capitalism. Okay, so if that didn't make sense to you, please stay tuned and I will explain all in the next few slides. Now, just starting here where we left off in the last class, in 1833, the Factory Act was put in place where no children under the age of 9 were allowed work in any factories. Children between the ages of 9 and 13 years old were allowed to work, but not more than 9 hours a day. So 12-hour shifts were out for children between the ages of 9 and 13, and no children were allowed work at night time. So night shifts were not allowed for children, and also all children were to receive 2 hours of schooling a day, and factory inspectors would be set up to enforce these new laws in factories. Now, as I said in the last class, this meant that a lot of families were heavily affected by less people working within the household, but it also meant that our elderly people and people above the age of 13 were finding it easier to get employed, as prior to this people working in factories and mines were predominantly below the ages of 9. So there's advantages and disadvantages to the Factory Act. In 1842, the Mine Act was put in place. As we know from our previous slides, we would know that the mines were a very, very awful place to work. Predominantly children used to work there. They were used to dig mine shafts to push out coal, where we seen trappers for glocking in or to keep in gases from spreading around tunnels. And we also seen how they would use trapper ponies. Now, as you know, the conditions in these mines were not ideal, and in 1832 they passed the Mine Act, which would not allow any children under the age of 10 or women to work in the underground mines. Now, this is underground, as children were allowed to mine overground, such as quarries. Now, I know you could say that's not considered a mine, but they still were allowed working quarries, but they were not allowed into any coal mine. In 1848, we also seen the Public Health Act instated. Now, this was after an article written in 1842 by Edward Chadwick called the Sanitary Conditions of the Labour Population. Now, this basically outlines the awful conditions that people working in the Industrial Revolution had to face, and the living conditions they had to face into once they came home. And it said that it wasn't above board and it wasn't ethical to keep people living in these brutal conditions. So in 1848, the government were pushed into signing in the Public Health Act, which meant that people had rights to certain public health, and it would soon become the responsibility of businesses to make sure that people had the right living conditions. Now, before the Public Health Act was instated in 1848, some business owners and wealthy landlords actually set up their own form of a health act within their own businesses. So one such person was Robert Owens, who had his business in Scotland in New Landmark, and this was in the 1800s. Now, he also brought in his own program of social and educational reform within this business, which we'll be looking at next. Now, Robert Owen's reform was very, very influential in a social and educational way for a business owner. A few things that he set up within his businesses was he set up creches for mothers so that they could send their kids to creches while they worked. He also instated that children would have free education for every child within the program. Also, universal healthcare for all his workers. Now, it's important to state too that not every company has universal healthcare. Not actually, a lot of companies don't have universal healthcare for their workers, even in today's standards. So this was huge if we think about it for the 1800s, and also night classes for his workers so that they could become furtherly or further their education. So this was very important. Now, Robert Owen's profits soared even though he had the added expense of the better living conditions for his workers and the additional cost of further education and creches and the healthcare system for them as well. So even though he was considering all these different things for his workers, his profits soared, and they say that this was down to the fact that his employees respected him more and they worked harder for him. And this was the beginnings of socialism, which we'll be looking at next. Now, this led Robert Owens to become or be known as the father of British socialism. And just to give you an idea of socialism is an economic theory that runs opposite to capitalism. Okay, so we'll be looking a bit more into that next. Now, to understand or to explain socialism, I first had to explain capitalism to show you how people were living during the Industrial Revolution and how people still are living today. So, capitalism puts an emphasis on private individuals setting up businesses. So, if you think of a business owner or a shop owner or even someone that sets up a tech company, this is the kind of ideals of a capitalist society, and it's their profits that will drive up the rest of the country. So if people pursue their own self-interests society will become a wealthier and ultimately improved society by encouraging people to become motivated by their own interests. Now, socialism or socialists believed that capitalism led to the exploitation of its workers, and they wanted a greater government control, or they wanted government to have greater control over businesses. So the idea behind it was that if government had more control over businesses, there would be better rights and better conditions for the workers within these factories, and it wouldn't be to seek the exploitation of their workers. Now, these socialist ideas were taken on board by these two socialists that we're going to take a quick look at here, and you'll later be investigating them more in your history studies, and that is Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, and they invented a system called communism. Now, communism took the ideals from socialism and socialist ideology and it expanded upon it. So these both men both lived in England during the Industrial Revolution, and they both were heavily involved in socialism and in the ideals of it. Now, they wrote a book called the Communist Manifesto, which echoed the sense of socialism, and it also said that the workers should own the factories instead of big, large factory owners that had no understanding of how the factory worked. Now, that brings us to the end of this presentation. And by now, you should know some of the reforms that were brought in to improve living conditions and some of the key reforms for the Industrial Revolution and the workers within the Industrial Revolution. You should also know the two different types of economic theories that emerged from the Industrial Revolution in response to capitalism. Now, as always, make sure you're taking down your notes and you submit them, and also you have a task to do which will be up on your Google Classroom. Okay guys, hope this helped.